It was a sunny Saturday morning when James Carter and his family arrived at their new home. The house, a two-story beauty with a neatly trimmed lawn, stood proudly in a quiet suburban neighborhood. James, a tall and confident man in his early 40s, was excited to start this new chapter. His wife, Lisa, and their two children, Mia and Jordan, were equally eager to settle in and make the place their own. As the family began unloading boxes from the moving truck, James noticed a man sitting on the porch of the house next door. The man, middle-aged with a strong build and wearing a white tank top, was watching them closely. His expression wasn't friendly. James, always one to make an effort, waved and smiled. But the man, Tom, didn't wave back. Instead, he stood up, folded his arms, and continued to stare. "Who's that?" Lisa asked as she carried a small box labeled kitchen. "Our new neighbor, I guess," James replied. "Doesn't look too happy to see us." Lisa frowned. "Maybe he's just curious. Let's not assume anything." James nodded but couldn't shake the feeling that Tom's gaze wasn't just curiosity. It was something else. As the day went on, Tom remained on his porch, watching the family's every move. When James glanced over again, Tom muttered something under his breath and went back inside, slamming the door. By evening, the Carters had finished unpacking most of their belongings. Maya and Jordan were running around the backyard, laughing and chasing each other, while Lisa prepared dinner in the kitchen. James stood in the living room, looking out the window. Tom was back on his porch, this time with a phone in his hand. He appeared to be talking to someone, and every now and then, he would glance toward James's house. The next morning, James decided to introduce himself. He walked over to Tom's house, a warm smile on his face. "Good morning," James said. "I'm James Carter, your new neighbor." Tom looked at him briefly before turning away. "Yeah, I saw," he muttered, not bothering to shake James's hand. James tried to keep the conversation going. "My family and I are excited to be here. It seems like a nice neighborhood." Tom gave a short laugh. "It was," he said, before walking back inside and closing the door. James stood there for a moment, taken aback by Tom's rudeness. Shaking his head, he turned and walked back to his house. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but it was clear that Tom had already made up his mind about them. Over the next few days, the tension only grew. Tom would avoid eye contact when passing by, but made no effort to hide his disapproval. James noticed him glaring whenever the kids played outside, or when Lisa tended to the garden. Still, James chose to remain calm and focused on his family. "Some people just take time," Lisa said, trying to reassure him. But James couldn't ignore the feeling that Tom's dislike wasn't about time. It was about something deeper. Little did James know, this was only the beginning of an incident that would bring the neighborhood and its assumptions to light. The days passed, but the tension between James and his neighbor Tom only seemed to grow. James tried to brush it off, focusing on settling his family into their new home. He painted the walls, helped Mia and Jordan set up their rooms, and even mowed the lawn to make the house feel like theirs. But every time he stepped outside, Tom's cold glare was waiting. One afternoon, James decided to take Jordan outside to play basketball. He had set up a hoop in the driveway, and Jordan was eager to show off his skills. As they played, Tom appeared on his porch, arms crossed, watching them closely. His presence was hard to ignore. "Dad, why is that man staring at us?" Jordan asked, his voice innocent but curious. James paused, looking at his son. "Don't worry about it, buddy," he said with a reassuring smile. "Let's focus on your game." Jordan nodded and went back to dribbling the ball, but James couldn't shake the feeling that Tom's behavior was becoming more than just unfriendly. Later that evening, as James sat on the couch with Lisa, he shared his concerns. "Tom hasn't said a single kind word since we moved in," James said, shaking his head. "It's not just me. He's even glaring at the kids now." Lisa sighed, setting down the book she was reading. Maybe he's just one of those people who doesn't like change. You know how some people can be about new neighbors. Maybe, James replied, though he wasn't convinced. But it feels like it's more than that. The next morning, James got up early to take the trash out. As he walked to the curb, he noticed Tom standing at the edge of his yard, staring again. James decided to try one more time to break the ice. "Good morning, Tom," James said, forcing a friendly tone. "How's it going?" Tom didn't respond. Instead, he muttered something under his breath and turned back toward his house. James felt his patience wearing thin, but he reminded himself to stay calm. He didn't want to escalate the situation. That afternoon, while Lisa was out grocery shopping, James decided to fix the fence in the backyard. As he worked, he heard voices on the other side. It was Tom, talking to another neighbor. Though James couldn't hear every word, he caught enough to understand the conversation. "Don't know why they moved here," Tom was saying. "This neighborhood used to be peaceful." James felt a tightness in his chest, but chose to keep working. He wasn't going to let Tom's words get to him. Still, the comments stung. Later that evening, as the family sat down for dinner, James noticed flashing lights outside the window. He stood up and peeked out, his stomach sinking as he saw 2 police cars pull up in front of their house. Moments later, there was a knock at the door. Lisa looked worried. "What's going on?" "I don't know," James said, heading to the door. As he opened it, 2 officers stood there, their expressions serious. "Good evening, sir," one of them said. "We received a report about suspicious activity in this area." James glanced over at Tom's house, where the curtains quickly shifted as if someone was watching. James sighed deeply, realizing exactly who had made the call. James stood in the doorway, his calm demeanor masking the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. The 2 police officers looked at him expectantly, one holding a notepad and the other glancing toward Tom's house. Lisa stood behind James, holding Jordan's hand, her face a mix of confusion and worry. "Suspicious activity," James repeated, raising an eyebrow. "What exactly was reported?" The officer with the notepad cleared his throat. "We received a call about someone wandering around the property, possibly trespassing." "Do you live here, sir?" James sighed deeply, resisting the urge to let his emotions take over. "Yes, I live here. My name is James Carter. My family and I just moved in last week." The officer hesitated, glancing at his partner, who nodded. "Do you have any identification, sir? Just to confirm." Lisa stepped forward, her voice steady but firm. "Is this really necessary? He just told you he lives here. This is our home." The officers exchanged a look before one of them said, "We're just following up on the call, ma'am. It's standard procedure." James held up a hand to calm Lisa. "It's fine." He walked over to a small table near the door and grabbed his wallet. Pulling out his ID, he handed it to the officer. "Here you go." As the officer examined the ID, James glanced toward Tom's house again. The curtains shifted slightly, and he caught a glimpse of Tom peeking out before disappearing again. James clenched his jaw but stayed silent. The officer handed the ID back. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. Everything seems to check out. We apologize for the inconvenience." "Inconvenience," Lisa said, her voice rising slightly. "Someone called the police on my husband for no reason, and you're calling this an inconvenience." James placed a hand on Lisa's shoulder, silently asking her to let it go. "Thank you, officers," he said calmly. "But maybe you should speak to the person who made the call." The officers exchanged another glance. One of them nodded. "We'll look into it. Have a good evening, sir." As the police walked back to their cars, James closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling deeply. Lisa crossed her arms, shaking her head in disbelief. "This is ridiculous," she said. "Who does that? Calling the police on their own neighbor?" "We both know who," James replied, his voice calm but firm. "Tom." Jordan, still holding his mother's hand, looked up at his dad. Why did they think you were bad, Dad? James knelt down, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. Sometimes people make mistakes because they don't understand, but it's important to stay calm and show them the truth. Jordan nodded slowly, though he didn't seem fully convinced. Lisa hugged her son, her expression softening as she tried to reassure him. The next morning, James stepped outside to retrieve the newspaper. As he bent down, he heard a familiar voice. "Didn't mean to cause trouble," Tom muttered from his porch. James stood up, locking eyes with Tom. "You didn't just cause trouble," he said evenly. "You called the police on your neighbor. That says a lot more about you than it does about me." Tom opened his mouth to respond but quickly turned away, retreating into his house. James shook his head, determined not to let Tom's actions define the neighborhood. He had bigger plans in mind. Here's part 4, written in 550 words, simple, engaging, and respectful. James started his day early, determined not to let the previous night's events ruin his mood. He brewed a fresh pot of coffee and sat by the window, watching the neighborhood slowly come to life. Kids walked to the bus stop. Dogs barked in the distance, and a jogger waved as she passed by. It felt peaceful, almost normal, until James noticed Tom watching him again from his porch. This time, James ignored him. He had no intention of letting Tom's behavior dictate his day. Instead, he focused on getting ready for an important meeting at work. As he ironed his shirt, Mia walked into the room, holding a drawing she had made. "Look, Daddy," she said excitedly, showing him a picture of their family standing in front of their new home. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," James said, kneeling to hug her. "You're quite the artist." Mia's smile faded slightly. "Do you think the man next door will like it?" James hesitated, unsure how to respond. "Why do you ask, sweetie?" "Because he always looks mad," Maya said innocently. "Maybe if I show him this, he'll be nice." James felt a pang of sadness but forced a smile. "That's very kind of you, Mia. But sometimes people need time to change." After dropping Mia and Jordan off at school, James headed to his meeting. As he walked into the building, he was greeted by several colleagues who congratulated him on his new role. James had recently been appointed as the city's new police chief, a position he had worked hard to earn. It was a role he took seriously, and he was determined to make a positive impact. Back in the neighborhood, Lisa decided to spend the afternoon planting flowers in their front yard. As she worked, she noticed several neighbors walking by, some offering warm greetings while others avoided eye contact. Lisa smiled politely, refusing to let the tension bother her. Tom, however, couldn't resist making his presence known. He stood at the edge of his porch, arms crossed, watching Lisa closely. Finally, he spoke. "You know, this used to be a quiet neighborhood." Lisa looked up, wiping her hands on her gardening gloves. "It's still quiet," she replied calmly, "and we plan to keep it that way." Tom muttered something under his breath and went back inside, leaving Lisa shaking her head. She didn't understand why he seemed so determined to create conflict, but she refused to let his negativity take over. That evening, James returned home to find Lisa waiting for him on the porch. "How was your day?" she asked, handing him a glass of iced tea. "Productive," James replied, sitting down beside her. "How about yours?" "Interesting," Lisa said, recounting her brief interaction with Tom. "He seems determined to make us feel unwelcome." James sighed. "I expected challenges when we moved here, but I didn't think it would be this blatant." Lisa placed a hand on his. "We'll get through this. Together." As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew he couldn't change everyone's perspective overnight, but he was determined to lead by example, not just as a police chief, but as a neighbor, a father, and a man who believed in doing what was right. The following morning, the neighborhood buzzed with activity as families prepared for the weekend. James decided to spend his Saturday fixing a loose gate in the backyard, trying to take his mind off the tension with Tom. Meanwhile, Lisa took Mia and Jordan to a nearby park, hoping to give the kids some fresh air and a break from the recent unease. As James worked, he heard a knock on the front door. Wiping his hands on a rag, he walked around to answer it. Standing there was a woman he hadn't met before, holding a plate of cookies and wearing a friendly smile. "Hi, I'm Margaret," she said, handing him the plate. "I live 2 houses down. I just wanted to welcome you and your family to the neighborhood." James smiled, feeling a bit of relief. "Thank you, Margaret. That's very kind of you. I'm James Carter. It's nice to meet you." They chatted for a few minutes, with Margaret asking about James's family and sharing details about the neighborhood. She mentioned the community events that happened regularly and encouraged James and Lisa to join. "Not everyone here is like, well, you know," she said, glancing briefly toward Tom's house. "Most of us are happy to have new neighbors." James appreciated her honesty, but chose to keep the conversation light. After Margaret left, he felt a glimmer of hope that not everyone in the neighborhood shared Tom's views. Later that day, Lisa returned with the kids, both of whom were eager to show James the flowers they had picked at the park. As they were sharing stories about their outing, Tom appeared on his porch again, this time holding a phone and speaking loudly. His voice carried across the yard. "I don't care who he says he is," Tom said into the phone, his tone sharp. "I've lived here for 20 years, and I'm not going to let some stranger ruin this neighborhood." James clenched his jaw, but refused to respond. Lisa placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "He's trying to provoke you," she whispered. "Don't give him the satisfaction." That evening, as the family sat down for dinner, the doorbell rang. James exchanged a glance with Lisa before getting up to answer it. Standing there were 2 uniformed police officers. James immediately recognized one of them. It was Officer Daniels, someone he had worked with in the past. "Chief Carter," Daniels said with a mix of surprise and respect. "We didn't realize this was your address." James raised an eyebrow. "Is there a problem, Officer Daniels?" Daniels hesitated before explaining. "We received another call about suspicious activity at this address, but clearly there's been a misunderstanding." James sighed, his frustration evident but controlled. "Thank you, officers. I think I know where the call came from. You're welcome to speak to the caller directly." The officers nodded and walked over to Tom's house. James watched as they knocked on the door. A few moments later, Tom appeared, his face pale as he realized who James truly was. James returned to the dining table, looking at his family. "I think our neighbor is about to get a reality check." James watched as the officers walked up to Tom's front door. He could hear muffled voices from inside, but the tension in the air was almost palpable. Tom had to know what was coming. After a few moments, the door opened again, and the officers stepped back, giving Tom a stern look. James could feel his heart race, knowing that this would be the turning point for his neighbor. After a brief exchange, the officers walked back to their cars, leaving Tom standing in his doorway, his face flushed red with embarrassment. He looked toward James, but his gaze quickly dropped to the ground. James remained calm, not willing to let the situation escalate any further. When the officers had driven away, James stayed outside for a while, hoping that Tom would come over and apologize. But Tom didn't make any move. It was clear that the man was not ready to face his own actions. Lisa came out to join him, her face full of concern. "Do you think he'll come over and talk to you?" she asked, her voice soft. James sighed. "I'm not sure. He's probably too proud to admit he was wrong." Just as James was about to head inside, he saw Tom step out onto his porch. This time, the man didn't seem to be glaring or muttering to himself. Instead, he was standing there quietly, as if debating what to do next. James gave him a small wave, signaling that he was open to a conversation. Tom hesitated, then slowly walked over to the fence separating their properties. He stopped just short of it, still unsure. James waited patiently, not pushing him, just giving him the space to speak. "Look, I didn't know who you were," Tom said, his voice quieter now. I made a mistake. James nodded, his expression calm. I understand. People make mistakes, Tom. What matters is what you do next. Tom looked down, rubbing the back of his neck. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have called the cops on you like that. I let my assumptions get the best of me. James took a deep breath and then spoke. You're right, and I'm glad you're able to admit it. I know change can be difficult for some people, but it's important to be open to it. Tom nodded again, his face still red. I'll try to be better, he said quietly. I don't know why I reacted that way. I've lived here a long time, and I guess I'm just used to things being a certain way. James smiled gently. I get it. Change isn't easy, but it's how we grow. It's how communities grow. There was a brief silence between them, and then Tom held out his hand. I'd like to start over, he said. I know I didn't make a good first impression, but I'd like to try and be a better neighbor. James took his hand firmly, shaking it. I think that's a good start. After the awkward but sincere exchange, Tom walked back toward his house, this time without his usual scowl. James and Lisa exchanged a glance, both relieved that the situation had been resolved without further conflict. As the evening settled in, James couldn't help but feel hopeful. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step in the right direction. Later that night, as the family sat down for dinner, James reflected on the day. Sometimes, all it takes is one conversation to change things, he said quietly. Lisa smiled. You're right. You handled that so well. James nodded. It's just about keeping your cool and doing the right thing. That's what I always try to do. The days after the conversation with Tom felt different in the neighborhood. James could feel a subtle shift in the air. People seemed more friendly, more willing to wave when they passed by. Even Tom, though still a little distant, began to make small attempts at conversation. James didn't expect an immediate change, but it was a start. One morning, James was out in the yard, trimming the hedges when he noticed Tom walking towards him. He was holding a small potted plant, the kind you might give as a gesture of goodwill. James raised an eyebrow, surprised, but he smiled and walked toward the fence. Hey, James, Tom said, his voice a little hesitant. I've got something for you. He held up the plant. It's not much, but I thought it might be a good way to say I'm sorry. I know I wasn't the best neighbor at first. James looked at the plant and then at Tom's face. There was sincerity in his expression, and that made all the difference. That's really thoughtful, Tom. Thank you. He took the plant from Tom's hand, admiring it. I appreciate this, and I'm glad we've been able to clear the air. Tom shifted his feet. I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other day. About change and how we can all grow. I don't want to be the kind of person who judges others based on things I don't understand. James smiled, feeling a sense of respect for Tom in that moment. It's not easy, but you're doing the right thing. Change takes time, but it starts with a willingness to listen and learn. Tom nodded, looking down at the ground for a moment before meeting James's eyes. I know, and I want to do better, for you and for everyone in this neighborhood. I guess I just needed a little push. James chuckled. We all do sometimes. They stood there for a few moments, talking about their families and the neighborhood. It wasn't an intense or heavy conversation, but it was real. For the first time, James felt like Tom was genuinely trying to make amends, not just going through the motions. Later that week, James was invited to a community gathering, a sort of neighborhood barbecue that was being hosted by some of the local families. As he and Lisa arrived, James was surprised to see Tom there, standing with a few of the other neighbors. He waved at James and smiled, a genuine, unforced smile. Glad you could make it, Tom said, walking over to him with a handshake. James shook his hand, feeling a sense of warmth he hadn't felt before. Thanks for inviting me. It looks like a great turnout. It is, and I'm glad you're here. We've got to keep making this place a better, more welcoming community. As the evening went on, James noticed that people were more open, more willing to talk and get to know each other. It wasn't a perfect neighborhood yet, but it was getting there. James could see the effort everyone was making to be kinder, more understanding. As the sun set and the barbecue came to a close, James felt a quiet sense of pride. It wasn't just about what had happened between him and Tom. It was about the whole community coming together, learning and growing. James realized that sometimes the smallest actions, like helping a neighbor or having a difficult conversation, could lead to bigger changes. As he and Lisa walked home, he turned to her and smiled. "It's good to see things moving in the right direction." Lisa nodded. "It's the beginning of something better." James agreed. And sometimes, all it takes is one small step to make a difference.